Hi everyone, welcome to today's session. My name is Sophie and I am Commercial Director at Pulsar for the Australia New Zealand region. And I'm welcoming you to today's webinar and just introing you as to what you can expect from today's session. So the title of today's webinar is Audience First Marketing, a Playbook. And it's really an exploration of what it means to be audience-centric in practice when it comes to marketing and communication strategies. So today's session is going to be led by Pulsar CEO and founder Francesco, who has spent the last 15 years exploring audiences through online conversations, essentially through the vast mass of the internet, and using that data to help us really understand online audiences, not as a mass or a monolith, but as a collection of niche communities, of nuanced communities, and then using that data and insight to help inform how marketeers and communications professionals can be more personalized and targeted in the way that they speak to their audiences, to ultimately produce better engagement and better return on investment when it comes to those marketing and communication strategies. So for those of you that don't know, Pulsar is an audience intelligence company. We use online and social data to help better understand people, to understand their opinions, their attitudes, their quirks, essentially. And we then are able to get a sense of how narratives, how stories, how trends spread amongst those audiences, and ultimately how many of the same individuals can contribute to the same conversation, but differently according to their own unique take or background. So really this session today is an origin story of Pulsar's work and approach to social research, which informs audience-first marketing and communications. And some of the clients that we're already working with in this region who are using Pulsar's insights to inform that audience-first approach to their strategies include Cricket Australia, Northern Territory Government, Canterbury and Otago universities, and Domino's Pizza. So we're already seeing a huge engagement in this region and desire to better understand audiences and consumers to help inform more effective marketing and communications. So we hope you enjoy the session today and you find it informative and instructive. If you have any questions at all, then put them into the chat so that Fran and our webinar mediator, Loren, can answer them in the Q&A portion of today's session at the end of the presentation. We hope you enjoy. And yeah, I will now pass over to Fran. Thanks, everyone.
Great to be with you today, guys. It's a bit of a greatest hits kind of talk, because after doing this job for a few years, we realized that the approach that we put together to help the companies that work with us through our tools and through our research services, actually, we never really created like an introduction or a background or a playbook for the origin story of what we're doing, and so we decided to give it a name, and so we started talking about audience first marketing, and then we realized actually when it comes to talking about audience first marketing, you probably also need to think about it in the terms of a playbook, because it's quite useful to be able to have a step-by-step guide into what it is and what it does and why it does it. So with that in mind, I put together this talk to introduce the idea of audience first marketing, where it comes from, and then some of the applications that we use in our day-to-day. So the starting point is that everyone talks about being audience centric in this day and age. You wouldn't find a marketeer that doesn't say that, but there's very little agreement about what does he actually mean in practice. So this talk looks into that very question, and the kind of like first kind of like answer that I would give to that question is that audience first marketing means mapping creative and targeting strategy onto the shape of the audience and the shape of the conversation. Now, shape of the audience, different people might sound very obscure. So this talk looks into where those ideas came from and how we developed them into a framework. So just a quick recap for who kind of like doesn't know exactly what Pulsar does. I think the easiest way to explain it is to go with that episode of Succession when Kendall has done something really massively embarrassing, and it's all over the web, and he's asking Greg to tell him what's the story about him, and Greg goes, well, the internet is big, it's obviously I can't read it all. So effectively, the simplest way to explain what Pulsar does is that we help Greg read the whole internet. But if you, like my mom, haven't watched Succession, you don't know what I'm talking about, a Ponzier way of explaining what we do is saying that we are an audience intelligence firm, meaning that we mine data from the internet to help figure out smarter ways to talk to audiences. And we mine public data that come from the news, from social platforms, from search providers. And then we allow you to add your first party data to be able to build what we call an attention trail that helps us understand what your audience is paying attention to, what they care about, and how does it connect to what you're trying to do. Now, I want to start this talk with a clip that got a few marketeers quite excited a while ago, like a couple of months ago.
He's produced for Johnny Cash, Jay-Z, and Adele. He certainly doesn't look like a record executive.
I'm here with the live room.
And as we found out, Rick Rubin doesn't think like one either.
The audience comes last.
How can that be?
Well, the audience doesn't know what they want. The audience only knows what's come before.
Isn't the whole music about what somebody likes?
Maybe for someone else it is, but it's not.
Great. So we heard from Rick Rubin, legendary record producer, and his point of view on audiences, saying that the audience comes last, shocked a few people. A few people jumped at it against the ideology of the audience-centric marketing. And I thought it was a really good starting point for us to look into the problem. And if you kind of like superficially look at this point of view, it kind of like sounds like reminiscent of an argument brought forward by Henry Ford, which is, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. But we have zero evidence that Ford ever said those words. But it is true that he did think along those ways, and it costed him dearly, actually. So his main innovation was the optimization, not the invention, of the assembly line. And so the last thing he wanted to do was changing the product and mess with his setup, because the main value that he was bringing to what he was doing was having kind of optimized the assembly line for the production of cars. This worked really well initially, giving him high margins, but over time, he ended up losing about 60% of the market to competitors in about 6 years between 1921 and 1927. Now, Rick Rubin and Ford seem to be on similar paths, but they're actually not. So Ford is trying to optimize the production system and doesn't want to change it according to the changing needs and behaviors that can what's emerging in the market, with competitors producing cars in new colors and different shapes and different kind of like functions. And so he's falling out of step with his audience. Rick Rubin is actually saying that he understands the audience better than the audience understands itself. And he can anticipate the evolution of its taste because he understands the needs of his audience. And for this talk, I enlisted the help of some historical and current icons to help us give us a view on audience first marketing, and I've asked ChatGPT to help me bring them back to life. So the first point of view comes from the Terminator. It's kind of being what we were saying just a second ago about anticipating the audience. So in my experience as a Terminator, I've learned that it's crucial to anticipate the moves of your target, and the only way to do that is to understand their needs. Thank you for your attention. I'll be back. This point of view of anticipating the needs of your audience is not about knowing what your audience is. It's about being able to anticipate their desires, meet them where they will be. You have to give them what they dream of before they even had a dream. Amazing that we could even generate these things with a really simple prompt, but it says a lot about shaping the information around the need of the situation that you're in, like in this case, this talk. Marty McFly described it as the flux capacitors that powers the DeLorean. So the audience is like the flux capacitors that powers the DeLorean. Without it, you're just stuck in the past. And I found this quite amazing, actually. I would have loved for Marty McFly to have said something like that for real, but it's kind of useful to jump into what we're trying to do here. And so the idea of having a direct line with the audience is what has propelled a renaissance of corporate innovation over the last 100 years, where development driven by a scientific understanding of the needs and the dreams of an audience before the audience manifests them itself has turned into a science that we know very well as researchers. So Post-it notes, Walkman, Swifter, the Keurig machine, and the iPhone are just a small handful of examples of innovations that are deeply rooted in understanding specific behaviors from the audience that then got manifested into a product that fed them before that need was expressed by the audience openly. Over kind of like the last few years, that feedback loop has now been accelerated even further. So you have the whole space of open innovation where companies like Lego have been soliciting ideas from their audience with the Lego Ideas platform, for example. And this idea of getting inputs and ideas from everywhere in the audience has then now morphed into yet another evolution, which is the kind of like infinite loop that we see on TikTok, where the feedback loop has now become accelerated through examples of products that are being developed off the back of behavior spotted on TikTok. For example, one of our clients is a Chinese manufacturer that brings new product to market off the back of emerging TikTok trends. And TikTok find this kind of like loop structure to be also the way people go into their purchase behavior, and what we used to consider an end is now a continuous loop of reconsideration where consumers go in and out and understanding of what they like and why they like it and why they use it and how they use it. But meanwhile, another big change has happened, and that change is what we've seen in the search industry, where effectively you could say that search is the latest industry that has gone audience first. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that we kind of like getting closer to the end of the age of PageRank. PageRank was the algorithm that drives what Google does in terms of providing search results, and is the idea that the structure of the information on the internet, the links between the website, is what is determining what is the information that is most important for you to see based on what you're asking. Whereas with something like ChatGPT and generative AI in general, information is now morphed around the question you're asking, and it's not the structure of the information of the system that is driving the response that you're going to get. It's the structure of what you've been asking and your experience and the details and the way you're asking it that changes the way the information is reconfigured around your needs and presented to you in a conversational format. So that's quite a stark change of kind of like position in terms of like trying to understand what information is important and what isn't. Now, when it comes to marketing, actually, somehow we're still lagging behind. Like there have been all sorts of firsts in marketing: product first, brand first, creative first, competitor first, but not audience first yet. And I blame the romantics for this. Seems a bit long-winded, but marketing is a creative effort, and the romantics are the ones that came up with this view that creativity is an individual effort, stems from the genius of a single mind that elevates itself above everyone else. And guess what? They were kind of sexy, but they were actually wrong. Any creativity is always about connections and remixing and recontextualizing. No idea comes from the single mind of a single genius. creativity is by definition the result of a collective layered effort with many inputs along the way. And so the result of this romantic idea, we're still kind of paying for it, because creativity, intended as a genius, kind of like a result of genius, has funneled historically an anti-insights and anti-data culture within creative teams, for example. And I mean, it's not to say that the insight and data industry haven't been responsible for some very kind of like, daft insight and ways of doing insights. Like there's this amazing website that still amazes me, called Spurious Correlations, that shows how correlation with phenomena that seem to have a very similar statistical shape actually have nothing in common, but very often we tend to make mistakes like that. For example, increase in cheese consumption correlating with the increase of the number of people that die by becoming tangled in their bedsheet, which obviously have nothing to do with each other. But I think now it's time to, beyond cheese, reevaluate this approach, not just because we are in a post-romantic world, but because the whole system around that idea of creativity has changed radically over the last 100 years. And so the new constant of the world that we're living in is audience fragmentation. And we live in a world where anyone can have a voice and anyone can build an audience. And being relevant and distinctive in this kind of space has become survival strategy, not best practices. So knowing your audience is the only way to stay relevant and be able to emerge from that noise. But the problem that we're having on top of this is that the internet and the end of mass media and the end of linear media consumption have fragmented what we used to call audience. So we're starting from a place where there's something that we call an audience that we can reach as an audience, and now we're in a place where consumption is fragmented, audience is fragmented in niches, and therefore the landscape that we're dealing with is extremely more complex than it was before. And so we've gone from mass fan bases to a multiplicity of niches. And this is not news, this is just laying the foundations of what we're going to be talking next. And we've gone from cultural moments that unite us all into cultural movements that drive us in multiple directions. And that's not to say that this is negative or positive, it's just that the dynamics of the space that we inhabit as marketeers is very different from what it used to be. And that's why audience fragmentation is posing today the biggest threat, but also the biggest opportunity for any marketeer today. Now, one could argue that the mass never really existed, and I'm actually a big fan of this idea. Like this sociologist, Raymond William, said famously, there are no masses, only ways of seeing people as masses. And so the idea that the mass was actually something that didn't exist as an idea before the mass media has been quite kind of like accepted widely, and the mass was always a fiction to fit into a model that fit into a media ecosystem like the mass media ecosystem. And so once we recognize that mass as an idea is actually only something that exists in a sense that it benefits to a mass media ecosystem, you just start to see a revolution that changes the institutions, including the media and the way we market to people, because we're looking at the problem in a very different way. So if you frame them as masses, you see masses, but the internet has given us the ability to zoom in. And if we get to know people, our optics change. And this is what we are in the business of doing, helping organizations zoom in and zoom out whenever they want to see a kind of like a wider trend, but helping organizations zoom in so they can start building relationships with their audiences rather than marketing at them like they were a mass. So in 15 years of doing this job and studying how people behave online and how audiences are changing, and the one thing that have become clear by studying all the campaigns that we've been involved in is that it all starts and ends with the audience, specifically the shape of the audience. Now, we started from a very simple question. The question that we were asking at the beginning, like 10 years ago now, was why some things become a hit and some don't on the internet. And so we started to look at the memes that were like big at a time. This was one of them. And there was another one. popular at the same time. This is Harlem Shake. So when we started studying these memes, one of the things that we started to map out was the way they spread, and the way they spread in different ways. And what we realized is that immediately that there isn't one single pattern for virality. And so to try and make sense of these phenomena, we had to look at the spread from a few different angles. So we started mapping different dimensions, for example, the lifetime of a meme, how global or local the meme is, how popular it is within certain audiences, the amplification of the meme, how influential are the people that are getting involved, how quickly does it change over time in terms of attention, and how easily it is for people to consume it and then share it. And so the first learning that came out of that study, which was how video spread, the title of the study, was that there are two main virality models, a spark model and a grow model. So in a spark model, you have effectively content that is highly shareable with high velocity, high volatility, a higher peak, but a shorter lifespan. So something that kind of like burns out really quickly, blows up and burns out in the space of 12, 24 hours. And then you have a grow model where you have content that is spreading with a lower velocity, but is less volatile, and he has a longer lifespan. So these would be memes and information and narratives and conspiracy theories that would spread over weeks rather than days. And so when we started to see that this model actually applied to all the different things that we were studying, we were trying to understand why does something spread as a spark and something spread as a growing system? Like, why is that the case? And so we started looking at the way this content spreads online. And so we looked at how this information was being passed on to different members of the audience, and we discovered that every viral phenomenon has a specific engagement footprint. So the engagement graph, how does information X goes from point A to point B, where point A would be the blue dots that are sharing that content, and point B would be people that take that content and reshare it or comment on it. And so what we realize is that the shapes are very distinctive. Some shapes are really fragmented and some shapes are really cohesive. Some shapes have a really high number of big, large dots, and some shapes have a really high number of really small dots and smaller clusters around those dots. And what we realize is that we couldn't correlate the shape of the spreading to the model, to the velocity of the meme. So if someone would spread, in other words, graphs that are more fragmented and show a higher number of influential nodes are present in both virality modes, both the spark and the grow. And so we kind of went back to the drawing board there, because we were starting thinking then, we can't find the reason for why something spread fast or slowly in the content itself. So we started looking at the audience instead. So who's the audience behind the viral phenomenon? And so that led us to the shape of an audience. And so that led us to the idea and to the discovery that an audience is never a monolith, but always a system of communities. And this is what we call the shape of an audience. Now, what we discovered was also that the shape of an audience falls on a spectrum. Some audiences are more fragmented, some audiences are more cohesive. Fragmented audiences means a higher number of distinct communities of people that are similar to each other in those communities, with fewer connections and less overlap between them. A cohesive audience, on the other hand, is fewer distinct communities with a higher number of connections and bigger overlap between them. Now, we then discovered another interesting fact, that the shape of the audience, the structure of the communities in it, can actually predict how messages will spread. So, and this was amazing, because we found a correlation between how fragmented or cohesive an audience is and how quickly or slowly something goes viral. And so when mapping the memes that we were studying, we realized that if you have an engagement network like the one on the right, you would tend to have a community network like the one on the left, with like a smaller number of communities, and on the right, a high velocity spreading engagement network that will consume the meme in the space of 12 hours, and then the meme would be too saturated and everywhere for people to continue sharing it, so it would just die. On the other end, when you have something like the Ryan Gosling meme, where Ryan Gosling is eating his cereals, you will notice that the meme takes a lot longer to spread. And when you look at the structure of the communities behind the meme, you would see that there's a much higher fragmentation. It's a more mainstream audience, it's more broken down into many different types of communities, and there's less overlap between them. So the meme spreads a lot slower. So the shape of the audience also seems to predict the quality of the conversation. So what we realize is that kind of like fragmented or cohesive audiences would have an impact on how many different types of takes on a topic an audience would generate. So, and this is what we crystallize in the idea that different communities talk about the same topic differently, and different communities care about the same topic for different reasons. At one point, we were in a process with Netflix, and they said, we like the idea that you're able to give us a breakdown of an audience behind the discussion of a TV show, but we actually want this process to go the other way too. We want to be able to see how different communities produce a different conversation on their audience. And they were kind of right. So if you look at a very neutral show, like the Marie Kondo show on Netflix, you would see how a cluster would be using their audience about making comments about current affairs. So everyone in your city was tossing out stuff at the same time this weekend, and the answer why will not surprise you. So commenting on people recycling, commenting on politics. Another kind of like audience that was kind of like more a mainstream Brazilian audience into everyday news was talking about the show in terms of ways of getting things done at home. That we're talking about methods of cleaning up and cleaning and tidying up their home based on what the show was doing. Another cluster of audience members, another community, was a more kind of like highbrow type community, was talking about the audience with an ironic take. So I watched a few episodes of Marie Kondo show, and now I can see negative, anti-joyful auras around everything in my house. I suspect a cheap gnome sculpture sent me into a spiral of depression last August. So what you start seeing here is that if you know the breakdown and the structure of your audience into communities, you can actually start understanding how that audience might engage with your marketing or with your products, and you can start creating strategies that map onto that structure. And so we actually kind of like started to make this audience plus content analysis the trademark of what Pulsar does. And we built a tool that clusters stories on one end and audiences on the other end. And so we built a tool that does identify bottom-up stories and beliefs and cluster the audiences behind them into communities. And so by this point, we knew that if the shape of an audience predicts how content will spread, but also the reaction that it will generate, we can then potentially use it for planning. And so the hypothesis at this stage, and we come back to what we showed at the beginning, was mapping creative and targeting onto the shape of the audience and the shape of the conversation will give you best results in terms of how your content performs, how your targeting performs, and the ROI that you generate. Now, I don't want to rain on the parade, but as ChatGPT-4, as Aubrey Plaza said, oh sure, because nothing says authenticity like a group of corporate suits obsessively analyzing your latest data on consumer trends and preferences. I'm sure the audience just loves feeling like a statistic in a spreadsheet. Keep it up, marketing geniuses. You're really making a connection with the people. And not to take on Aubrey immediately, but Mitzi Del Bra from Priscilla is actually, expressing an initial view that is similar to that. Some folks might be skeptical about audience-first marketing. They might think it's pandering or fake. But think of it like a drag queen getting ready for a show. You wouldn't just throw on an old outfit and makeup and hope for the best, would you? No, you tailor your look and performance and give them what they came for. How do we tailor our look and performance in marketing? So we use an audience-first planning framework that's built into the product. So we have these 4 steps that we define as identifying the narrative that I want to study, for example, sustainability, segmenting the audience behind the narrative, understanding what key communities are engaged in that discussion. And for each one of these key audiences, we cluster the conversation. So we look at the types of stories that their audience buys into or believes or disagrees with when it comes to the specific narrative that we're studying on sustainability. And then we optimize execution based on that. We optimize execution in 3 ways: spend, So how quickly or slowly are we spending? How much are we spending on each type of audience to make sure that we get to the entire audience that matters to our target? What kind of targets do we identify, and how do we describe those targets? How do we identify the right influencers across all the different communities? Because remember, the audience is fragmented. So identifying 100 influencers that do not connect with the various different communities in the audience might leave you with just exposing your message to one of the 10 communities that are relevant to you. And then finally, creative. What kind of language, topics, attitudes, behaviors, and occasions can we weave into the way we talk about this topic based on how these different communities see the topic? So if you think about this model, this kind of changes the way you think about audience insights, because different communities care about the same product for different reasons. So we build communities, point of views, and briefs for every subject that we're exploring for marketing. Or if you're looking at creative strategy, we build a matrix for the moment, the occasions, the language by community. So when you're talking about beer, you have a matrix that tells you how your top 5 communities that you want to reach engage with a specific subject, so that you can then brief creatives in that way. Influencer marketing, as I said, is about understanding the key influences by community, not in general across the entire audience. Or reputation intelligence, for example, is a really good example. You can now map the reputation by community rather than by a generic audience. And so you can do way more advanced stakeholder intelligence than you would if you were just looking at a generic framework. Now, as Crocodile Dundee would put it, as a bloke who spent his fair share of time in the bush, I know the importance of understanding the audience and speaking their language. As Dame Edna put it, it's about making them feel special and show them that their opinions matter. Snoop Dogg through, how challenging it was to do his job as a rapper without the tools that we have, so crazy stuff. But through it all, we knew that the key to success was connecting with your audience, to be authentic, speak the language. And we asked Nick Cave to connect on the level. You can create something that is meaningful. And if you create something that is meaningful, you have a chance to create something that can inspire people to dream, to imagine, and to believe that anything is possible, and therefore can be something that is transformative. Now, if we bring this down a notch to our daily life as marketeers and researchers, if you think of campaign optimization, how do you use this model? So if you want to optimize your campaign using an audience first model, you can look at the shape of the audience to understand what you need to do. So if you have a cohesive audience where the conversation rate is high, and you know that your job is to sustain that engagement, because in a cohesive audience, you risk of reaching saturation quickly, and the message that you're putting out will start dying out really quickly. So your job there is to sustain that engagement. So you want to pace the spend, and you want to target the larger communities first, and then out the more fringe ones over. Because you know that cohesiveness will cause saturation in your audience, you want to serialize your content, so you make it last longer and avoid saturation due to the quick fire spread of the same content. If we look at all the campaigns that we've analyzed, we can generally map them onto this system and try and plan them or optimize them based on this system as being quite productive for us. Again, let's see from Aubrey. Let's forget about our expertise and just cater to every whim of every individual out there. Sounds like a solid plan. Let's just rename our company Audience Pleasing Marketing and call it a day. I mean, who needs a strategy when you have a bunch of fickle, ever-changing customers to please? Now, as a counter to this objection that some being inspired by the audience, it's about creating something that feels unique, that stands out from everything else out there, and something that is based on you taking risks. And we need to be willing to push the boundaries and challenge people's expectations. And this is where the crucial point comes. But you need to know what those expectations are if you want to challenge them. Isn't ChatGPT good? We put these kind of like ideas to the test. So we analyzed about 100 brand campaigns since 2020 to test this hypothesis. And the maps that you see on the back of this chart that are loading up, I'm not going to let you wait for the whole thing, but they're all actual campaign maps of the audiences that we've analyzed to test this hypothesis that if you align creative and targeting strategy to the shape of the audience and the shape of the conversation, you get better outcomes. So let's look at some numbers. So when a display ad is supported by targeting and creative that are driven by audience first planning, meaning that you follow the idea that the shape of the audience and the shape of the conversation can inform the creative that you use and the targeting you're using. We see that click-through rate went up 2.2 times. We see that retail click-through rate went up 3.2 times. And this is what we've done with Twitter on a vast range of campaigns from brands across the world. And so we know that a 10% increase in conversation supports a 3% increase in sales. So what we wanted to measure here was what kind of marketing outcomes can I expect based on targeting and creative to generate more conversations and therefore more conversions if I follow this audience first approach. And so what we saw is that when social ads are targeted and are designed in terms of creative with an audience first planning framework, what you get is when you go audience first is 11.8 times larger than the audience that join the conversation if you only target using demographics or if you don't follow the shape of the conversation to design your creative. So when your creative and your targeting is in line with the structure of the audience and the structure of the conversation, the ads that you're generating produce 11.8 times more people to join the conversation off the back of the ads that they've seen. When you do the same approach, but instead of following the structure of the audience, you create targeting based on interests rather than demographics, you still see a major increase on what you normally see if you target by demographics, which is 7.1 times the amount of people that join the conversation after seeing an ad, because it's just more relevant to them. When you do interest targeting, another interesting, excuse the pun, effect is that conversions grow 4 times. So when the targeting is done in a way that makes the targeting extremely relevant to the audience that you see, the conversion rate of the people that are seeing that ad and clicking on that ad and going on to watch a movie, buy a product is 4 times higher than if you don't do that. And then finally, when the community insights are shaping the creative. So when the conversation that you see from the different communities is then reflected in the creative that you show to these different communities through your advertising strategy, the conversation that is generated is 4.6 times higher than if you follow whatever other creative process that does not involve the shape of the conversation as an input. Now, in conclusion, your audience is not a monolith. Your audience is a system of communities. Each community sees the same topic differently. And we basically see the audience as a prism that takes a topic, a narrative, or a brand, and refracts it back on the other side as a range of variations on the original message, depending on the communities in the audience that are playing the message back. And so every audience and the system of communities and point of views that that brings is unique. And that is what makes the brand unique. And understanding your audience is the key to distinctiveness, to the point that we actually advocate more and more for looking at the audience as the distinction point, the distinctiveness point that a brand or a product have in market, not the product itself, not their marketing, not the brand, but the audience that kind of like coalesces around that message. And so if you don't want to go audience first to be distinctive, that's fine, but at least do it for the money, because as we've seen in all our analysis, audience first planning can drive better ROI for spend, for targeting, and for creative. And this is what we mean when we say that the audience is the message. And if you remember nothing else from this talk, but just this one thing, is Catherine Tate saying, "Am I bothered?" Well, you should be. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Fran, for that insightful look into audience-first marketing. And now we'll kick off some Q&A. So we've got some questions here for you, Fran.
Great.
one of them, first one off the cab off the rank, is what would you say to marketers who are seeing their audience as a monolith, and what are they losing out on because of that?
Well, I think first of all, if you've seen your audience as a monolith, your life is easier. So that's an upside because you're worrying about less things. You're worrying about fewer things, and you are dealing with one single approach to your audience, and there is an upside. But the downside is that you're definitely going to be less relevant than you could be to the majority of your audience, because you're inevitably effectively just being targeting one subset of your audience without even knowing which one is it. And so you are going to be playing in a kind of like almost like in a blindfold, because you don't know exactly what is relevant to whom, and therefore your strategy, you might get lucky, and your strategy might be relevant to the biggest community in the audience, but you might also be extremely unlucky and just be relevant to a really tiny portion of that. So if you want to be in control, and if you want to maximize your chance of being relevant and therefore generate the highest level of engagement with your audience, the only way to do that is to break down your audience into the communities that he actually naturally kind of like breaks down into, and understand how your strategy can map onto those.
Very interesting. And I guess like if you're more focused on targeting those niche groups as well, the potential for your content to really take off and maybe spread farther, is that more of a probability if you're more focused on your niche groups rather than the wider mass?
Yeah, so I think that there's an important distinction here, because people assume that if you're not targeting your audience as a whole, you're automatically on the other end of the spectrum, which is targeting the niches. But actually, what you're trying to do there is to you're in between effectively. So you're trying to say, I'm not going to go with a one-to-many messaging. I'm going to go with a one-to-few messages, which is not one-to-one. And so effectively, you're like in the middle of that continuum, and you're saying, I'm going to try and identify the best chance of success for my message to spread within a certain audience. And so the idea is not that you target a niche. The idea is that you have an understanding of the structure of the audience, so you can prioritize what are the top 5 sub-communities in your audience that are going to help you get to the majority of your audience. And the reason why we do that is that what we realized earlier on when we were studying audiences and what makes stuff go viral and when stuff doesn't go viral is that there is a process of osmosis that happens between different communities in an audience, but that osmosis has to be engineer for it to have the best chance of reaching the majority of an audience. And so the problem is that different communities in an audience do not necessarily connect with each other. A lot of these communities, which don't necessarily have to be niche communities, that can be like, I don't know, a community can be like 20-30% of an audience, but it could be completely disconnected from another community that is 50% of their audience. So if you're not taking into account that this connection between different sub-communities in an audience, you might end up sinking your message into the smallest of the communities that exist in an audience and never actually reach the potential to engage with the majority of the audience. So this work really is about less the targeting of niches and more about giving you the best chance of reaching the majority of your audience. And the thing that people don't realize is when they go with one single message for the entire audience, they think they're targeting the entire audience, but they're actually not. They're targeting whatever they get lucky with finding an affinity. And it might be a big community, but it might also be the smallest and the nichest one in the audience.
Very interesting. And talking about like audiences and audience segmentation, like are there different methods to segmenting audiences? I've heard you mention before in other talks about like bottom up, top down kind of methodologies. Can you explain those for us?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of axes that that you can map segmentation models onto. One is the type of signals that you take into account, and what we've seen over the years is that we have gone from 20-30 years ago segmentation models that were based on demographics to segmentation models today that are based on attitudes and affinities, what some people call psychographics. And the reason why this shift has happened is because lifestyles have obviously changed, and therefore someone in their 50s might have the same, might exhibit the same behaviors and the same attitude than someone in their 20s. So age doesn't necessarily, for example, predict a difference in attitudes when it comes to climate change, or when it comes to physical activity, or when it comes to aesthetics. So over the last few years, we've been kind of like prioritizing the idea that segmenting audiences based on their psychographics is more conducive to a predictive understanding on how they're going to behave, rather than using simpler indicators like age or whether people have kids or not. The other big shift has been in the from the top down to the bottom up approach. So traditionally, the top down approach would be, as an organization, I know who my audience is, I know who my target audience is, and I have a few things that define my target audience. So I'm going to go out there and find the people that fit into the model that I already have. And what happened with audience intelligence and the availability of large kind of like data sets on the web is that we can now go on to a journey of audience discovery that before was very complex to get on, because the traditional market research methodologies like surveys would have to have a very broad footprint to be able to identify completely new audience that you are not looking for initially. So what we've seen over the last few years is that there's been an over kind of like almost over enthusiasm, but for good reason, of like bottom up methodologies where you're actually going out there and looking at who is the audience that is coalescing around this idea, around this brand, based on the audience that is coming up, engaging with something online. And what we're seeing now is a slightly more balanced view of that process, where some products and some organizations are starting to allow you to be able to merge the two models, where you use data from the internet to understand what audience organically is congregating around the topic, an issue, or an icon or an idea, but then retrofit that audience into an existing segmentation model where you are prioritizing certain dimensions, like I want to know who the key communities of basketball fandom look like globally, but I also want to retrofit that into a segmentation model that primarily look at who has kids and who doesn't. And then I want to look at those bottom-up communities, but in the lens that is more conducive to segmenting the audience based on what my business cares about the most, which is families versus people that don't have kids. So I think it's a really good time for these methodologies, because traditional approaches are now being fused with more kind of like data-driven bottom-up approaches, and I think something nice is going to come out of it.
Yeah, definitely. Like in all of the different bits of content on Pulsar's website, you really see that fusion of like marketing and insights, and it's really cool to see what comes of it. A question we have in the Q&A is, when breaking up the audience into communities, how do you account for individuals who might fit into multiple community groups? Youth and culturally and linguistically diverse and female.
So again, there's two ways of looking at this problem, depending on the variables that you look at. For example, in any audience, you have influencers, but you also have connectors, and these are two very different types of prominent individuals in an audience. So an influencer would be someone that has an element of social influence, as defined in social psychology, over a certain community that they have an impact on, and therefore they're connected to. But that specific influential voice might not be connected to any other community. And so you might have someone that is really prominent with a big following and a lot of engagement, but actually only relevant to a specific community. Then you have connectors, who are people that might have individually a lot less power in terms of social impact, in terms of like how sizable is their following and how engaging their their content is, but those individuals tend to sit at the intersection of multiple communities, 2, 3, or 4 different communities. So sometimes those connectors are called micro-influencers because they tend to have a much smaller personal footprint, but actually they open up different communities, and therefore they act as a gateway between 2 different sub-audiences. It's really important to have a really good understanding of both, because if you really want to engineer those osmosis in your audience and making sure that the idea that you are communicating travels across the different communities, you need to have a really good understanding of the geography of your audience, who the key influencers are and who the key connectors are, and then build your influencer strategy accordingly. One of the key things that we always stress is that when planning those influencer marketing strategies, if you don't have a clear understanding of the geography of that audience in terms of like the breakdown of those communities, you might end up just picking the most influential people within a single community, and therefore you might invest all your budget on engaging with 100 people that really only talk about that 20% of an audience that it's really important, but it's just 20% of it, and that process of osmosis between that community and the other communities doesn't happen. The other thing that you mentioned that is quite important to stress is that depending on how you segment your audience, you might end up with certain variables creating a different type of segmentation model because you've used a certain methodology to get to that segmentation. So for example, if you might end up with a segmentation that goes, if you look at music genre, and you can have a segmentation model that identifies fans of a certain genre, say like, I don't know, techno music, and you can have segmentation model that generates a bottom-up approach that tells you that there are like UK techno fans versus Japan techno fans versus US versus Australia techno fans. And you can have one that instead looks at techno fans globally in general and compares it to folk fans and compares it to heavy metal fans. Now, you might end up with 2 different models because you've used a different approach to segmenting that audience. The first approach that ends up being localized by language and country, for example, is an approach where you're prioritizing signals that identify an interaction between people. So when you say, for example, segment the audience primarily based on who is interacting with whom and who is following whom, that kind of model based on what we call the social graph gives you a breakdown of communities based on inevitably the language that people speak and the countries that they're from as a proxy of that language, because you interact the most with people that speak the same language as you, and you tend to cover the same issues with people that are part of the same cultural bubble, and therefore you end up with multiplying a specific segment across different countries, geographies, and languages. If you instead use an approach that is about clustering audiences by similarity, and you just look at the profile of the affinities of an audience, and you almost look at like a cultural DNA, then you end up having something that brings those what used to be variations by country and by language of the same interest profile, people that love techno, into one single global profile, which is anyone that shares that kind of passion for that specific type of music, that correlates with specific passion for specific fashion brands and specific ideas and specific type of other variables that you're segmenting for. So the signals that you use to segment an audience really do influence the output that you get in terms of segmentation. And so if you're looking at creating a segmentation, what is really important is to define the objective of the segmentation. So if your segmentation is aimed at devising an effective communication strategy and you want your message to spread amongst a specific audience that you have in mind, then you need to prioritize segmenting by signals that are based on a social graph. So who interacts with whom and who's following whom, because you know that those people know each other, and therefore if you communicate something with a member of audience A, you know that they're going to pass it on to audience B, C, and D. But if you're looking at an insight segmentation, an insight-driven segmentation, when you're just trying to model the audience of a brand to come up with strategy, then you're better off with an affinity clustering that transcends the distinctions of country and language and groups them into interest profiles globally, because you're just interested in understanding the types of people that are part of an audience, so that you can come up with better ideas to talk to them. So depending on the aim, different signals help you get to the segmentation model that actually you really need.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting, like different audience groups and making sure you understand their various affinities and their interests to help your strategy. And something else that I thought was quite interesting in your talk was the idea of narratives and understanding the nuances and layers of different narratives. But like, how can brands and marketers understand what might be an irrelevant topic to them? How can they understand that paying attention to those narratives could help them in a way, because those narratives might impact them?
Yeah, so I think there's two interesting points to explore in this question. The first one is the concept of narratives. So traditionally in social listening and in media monitoring, the analysis is driven by specific keywords that have been mentioned in specific content that is being tracked using those keywords. Now that method is quite medieval, if you like, as in you are taking public opinion, which is an amorphous blob of thoughts and perceptions and expectations and judgments and, you know, anything that comes with it, and you are dissecting it into chunks based on whether it matches your keywords or not. That's a very unnatural way of understanding culture and understanding public discourse. And what happens with social listening and media monitoring is that you actually then take all those chunks that have matched the specific things that you asked for, and then you package them back together into topics or into trends or into any beautiful map that you can create out of that kind of analysis. But and this is gonna make a pun on myself, but this is a bit like making meatballs. So you are taking meat, you kind of like mincing it, and then you put it back together into meatballs. And that you know, as delicious as meatballs are, as an Italian, you are doing something very unnatural. And so what we're trying to do with narratives is to move away from that approach and take it a step closer to how culture actually works. So if you think of culture and public opinion, it works in waves and tides. You effectively have undercurrents that move in certain directions and drag anything that is caught into those currents in those directions. So those could be entities like, you know, politicians or celebrities or ideas, and they all get dragged into certain directions depending on where the tide or the undercurrent goes. So what we're trying to do with understanding narratives is the idea that we want to use a narrative as a data mining tool. So instead of mining using keywords, can we mine this data using a concept like narratives? And we operationalize that concept with a definition of narratives that includes two elements. So a narrative is a belief or a story that is held by a certain group of people. And then with this double lens of audience and a more holistic way of understanding discourse, like a story or a belief, we then put them together and then we use them to analyze the data to define the narratives. So that gives us a much more kind of like a natural way of looking at this data rather than just like splitting it and building it back into a Frankenstein. The second aspect of what you were asking is, how do you know which narratives are relevant or useful or bad for you? And I think that approach is based on some further research that you need to do. So you use tools like Pulsar to understand what the narratives are and what narratives are connected to you. But then you need to have some kind of like playbook for narratives to understand what types of narratives are detrimental or have a positive impact on whatever you're trying to do. And for that, the only way to have a clean and simple understanding of consequences and outcomes is to have a model for your own organization that knows what works for you and what doesn't, almost like food intolerances. And so brands almost have to do like a narrative intolerance test to understand which narratives are good for their organism and which narratives are not. And we are actually working on a product that helps us not only detect narratives, but map out narratives that generally tend to lead to better or worse outcomes. For example, analyzing the narratives around thousands of brands and analyzing tens of thousands of narratives connected to those brands, and then looking at which narratives are leading to a better share price performance, for example. But these are all correlations that you need to build to specific categories and brands to be able to have a predictive model. So we're trying to do that to simplify the amount of analysis that people need to do for themselves. But it's not ready yet, but it will be soon.
Got us on tenterhooks now. On the edge of my seat. We might start wrapping up as well, but lastly, what tools can I use to understand my audience segments better? And this feels like a very obvious question, and I'm not going to say the very obvious answer, but if you've got any, if you want to elaborate on that, please feel free.
Well, I think, first of all, it depends what your audience is, but if you only look without focusing on the obvious answers, there's a range of tools that feed on very different data streams, and the problem we have in the industry is that now these tools tend to not to consolidate those data streams into one answer, and so you have a very siloed approach to audience intelligence that feeds off these different data streams. And data streams can be, I don't know, web analytics data. So who comes on your website and who's engaging with it. Another data stream could be clickstream data. So you have panels of people that are part of research operations where you can see people share what they click on, and then you can build correlations between those behaviors and build predictive models of what they're going to be visiting next, and build an interest profile based on what websites you're visiting. Then you have the whole social media side of it, which looks at, which is a bigger beast, because it looks at how you can extract signals on an audience based on what people talk about, but you can also look at what people like or engage with, but you can also look at what people follow. And so this gives you three very different signals for mapping out audiences. And so if you just look at, for example, these three models, you have clickstream, you have web analytics, you have the social media side of things. There's already three very different type of products that exist in the market. And so depending on what you're trying to do, but also depending on what the objective of your analysis is, you need to use a different tool. And now ideally at some point in the future, we'll have one single solution that looks at all these different data streams. But to each objective, there's a different tool that does a better job. For example, if I'm trying to come up with creative strategy for a marketing campaign, I still believe that social media gives me the most granular understanding of the nuances that I want to build my creative hypothesis on, because it is a weird kind of like a new type of data form where you have a qualitative signal that expresses things that people don't need to be prompted on, that they share, kind of like bottom up. And so it can be a lot more diverse and rich, but it also is based on text, is based on videos, based on sound. So the quality of the signal is quite high definition, if you like. But then you have that qualitative signal on a quantitative scale, because you have billions of people doing it. And so it's the first time actually in history where we have the qualitative signal on a quantitative scale. And so the job is how to make it representative and how to make that output relevant to what you're trying to do. But if you're trying to come up with creative strategy, I believe that gives you the best chance of getting something nuanced and juicy that you can build on.
Yeah, I think that's really good to end on, actually, because you said earlier in the session that we should be inspired by the audience, and using all of that information and that data, any brand should be able to be inspired by their audience and really hone their creative that way. So thanks for bringing that great point back up again.
Great. Thanks for having me.